I remember 4 years ago when I met my shadow self for the very first time, or at least the most confronting and most terrifying encounter with one of the most evil and malicious parts of my own identity. It was on day 2 of a 3-day fast. I walked out of this library, sat down in the garden, and went into active imagination to meet my inner Tyrant. I was instantly transported into a medieval kingdom where the Tyrant's throne room was overlooking the castle courtyard, and there was a crowd of cheering populace. There were questionable reason why they were there. I mean, were they there because they wanted to see the Tyrant King, or because they had spears pointing in their backs? Anyway, the Tyrant went out on the balcony and he waved at the crowd and delivered a magnificent speech with a harem of courtiers around him. And of course, he ruled by fear and not by love, and his maliciousness, his greed, and his selfishness was merely my own selfishness projected in an imaginative way. I went into the active imagination. I confronted him once he'd returned from the balcony, and lo and behold, I found out after his strongman facade fell away that all he really wanted was love, and he cried into my shoulder, and I hugged him, and he went from Tyrant King to little inner boy, and I held that inner boy in my arms, and there I had met, confronted, and integrated my shadow self. And I'm going to show you how to do exactly the same with this video, or maybe I'm not, because that's a very dramatic story, and although that is a true story, I did have a 3-day fast about 4 years ago, and I met my shadow self. I have not integrated all of my Tyrant energy. I'm not now fully in contact with all of my shadow entities, territories, and behaviors from one active imagination, and the honest reality is that I feel almost emotionally manipulative sharing that story with you, because I don't think that shadow integration should be mystically inflated to something which is inaccessible and ritualistic at the sacrifice of being practical and immediately accessible. I don't want to teach you how to do active imagination in this overly dramatized way where you lose your sense of agency, because this is what's going to happen. I guarantee that this is going to happen because it's happened to me and I've seen it happen to dozens of clients. If you overly fascinate, you are putting yourself in a projective, unstable position where you are bound to pendulum swing into overt disgust or fear. If you're enamored by your golden shadow or the potential of your divine inner child, and you want to use active imagination as the bridge towards that part of your psyche, you will encounter a moment where it swings all the way back. The dualistic inner projection swings into the negative complementary component, and then you become disgusted, you become fearful, you become dissociative. Suddenly the inner king becomes the inner tyrant, the inner child becomes this shadowy spectral figure. I see it happen predictably and repeatably. So my real gift to you is not to give you stories of my inner psyche and my deep explorations of my incredible imagination and look at me as a storyteller. And I'm not making it up. I've had really powerful experiences. I just don't think it's that practical. We're going to be doing an active imagination walkthrough and demonstration. I'm going to show you how to practically speak with your various shadow entities by following the shadow behavior train that we explored in the previous Shadow Work series first episode. You can see that link down in the Shadow Work playlist and description. But fundamentally, we're going to be taking the idea of voice dialogue or parts work, which you may have also seen in internal family systems therapy, this idea of the multiplicity of the psyche, there being splits and fragments within your inner landscape, and we're going to try and find the various shadow entities, bring them from the shadow territories, and that is what we call integration. We're ultimately trying to find a stable middle point where we're not being swept up in shadow projections, we're not being fixed into shadow boxing dynamics either with ourselves or with our friends, romantic partners, or strangers on the internet. And fundamentally, we're getting our feet grounded in reality. So let's begin this with an actually grounded assessment of how to do this work before we go into any practical things, because it's not magical and mystical and complex. It's very, very simple to talk with your shadow. But let's make a quick disclaimer. based on this question, because some people are going to ask me this question: how do you develop imagination vividness? What do you do if you feel like you can't go into the guided active imagination space? What if you say, oh, it's all very well and good for you, Jordan, to be able to sit down in the garden in the middle of a 3-day fast, and aren't you mystical and spiritual, being able to have this elaborate inner landscape where you see full... Yeah, I get it. I get it. I'm a particular person. I have dreamt very vivid dreams since the beginning of my memory. I dream 4, 5, or 6 dreams per night. I have a very, very vivid imagination. Not everyone has this. Fundamentally, I've noticed that if you're watching a video like this, you've probably already got a decent imaginative faculty. You might not be struggling as that person who was asking how to develop imagination is. If you are struggling, a bit of a messy way of saying it, if you are struggling, the 2 things I can recommend: stop drinking, stop taking drugs, and stop consuming so much visual media. You just need to quiet your mind. And then once you've quieted your mind, I recommend that you read some good fiction books. Between the ages of about 16 and 20, I wasn't reading much non-fiction. I was reading the great works of history. I was reading a lot of the traditional Western canon. I was also reading some Greek myth. I was reading a variety of poetic stories. I read, I don't know how many books, not hundreds and hundreds, but a good amount of very good books. Even reading the classic Russian literature, reading the classic literature, just reading good stories. It's healing for your imagination, because you have to imagine the world. You practice the imaginative function of your brain starts to get strengthened. So you quiet down the overstimulus. You stop letting other people do your imagining for you with movies and TV series. You stop screwing up your own ability to create a cohesive through line of your own thoughts and your own perceptions by putting drink and drugs and overstimulus in the system. And then you'll find that you will also start dreaming more consistently. Your dreams will be deeper, and active imagination and dreams typically go very much hand in hand, because the night dream becomes the daydream, and the daydream, when it's made conscious, is active imagination. That's all it really is. You can read a book like Inner Work by Robert Johnson, where he's talking about how to develop active imagination vividness. I think I've got it down here. This is the classic book, another book that I recommend you read. In fact, fun fact, about 3 years ago, I did a video on active imagination where I held up this book, and I think it's still ranking in the top 2 or 3 places on YouTube. If you search active imagination, you're going to see me in a much less developed library with a lot more fascination and trying to figure out how to do YouTube and being all dramatic, but the reality is, you just don't need that drama. My actual work, working with people who are healing from trauma, working from people, you just don't need to do it. Let's go out of YouTube mode, let's go into proper teaching mode right now. If you've got your imagination, and if you've got the space in your life to want to do some shadow work, you need to understand the starting point, which is finding either a shadow behavior or a shadow entity that you want to open a dialogue with. But you can't have a dialogue with a shadow behavior. You can't have a dialogue with your promiscuity. You can't have a dialogue with your avoidance of romantic relationships. And you can't have a conversation with your own bad choices. The behaviors themselves aren't an entity, which is why you need to follow the behavior towards the entity, because there's 2 ways I recommend to my clients doing active imagination. Either you start with the behavior, which is typically the one that people they tend to go for behavior first, because you know that you've got a bad diet, you know that you're doing whatever your particular vices might be. Maybe you've just done something dreadful today, maybe you've done something deeply shameful this week, maybe you did something this year that really hurt someone. You know what that thing was. We then trace it towards the entity. That's gateway number 1. Other gateway is you know the entity. For example, if you have a particularly promiscuous streak inside of you and you've gone on a long stream of breaking hearts or having very shady relationships, you know that you're working with the shadow lover. Maybe you're working with the playboy, maybe you're working with the promiscuous woman, whatever the labeling might be that works for you, you're working with that shadow entity. Alternatively, you might be doing some spiritual shadow work, and your shadow entity is your spiritual self. You feel a bit distant from your meditation practices, you feel like you're no longer in a close relationship with God. Whatever the entity might be, for the sake of this video, we're going to start with behavior, because behavior takes us towards the entity anyway. So if you already want to start with the entity, you just skip the first step. Very, very simple framing. I don't want this to be magical and mystical. You talk with your shadow as if you were talking with someone who initially you may not know, but you want to have default respect, and then eventually someone that you do know, and you still maintain default respect. I want you to have the framing that you're talking with a real person who you're politely engaging with. You're not trying to go in and beat them up. You're not terrified that they're going to lash out at you. You're just having a normal conversation. There's a massive, massive, massive world of difference. At the very beginning, before you even close your eyes and drop into imaginative space, your framing of what's going to happen will create the image, will create the journey, and you're going to get a very different experience if you're going in with fear or with excitement versus a casual approach of, I'm going to go meet my shadow self today and let's go figure this out. Let's make it practical. Grounded perspective, shadow behavior. I'll give you something that I can work with in real time to make it personal. Let's go with my particular habit, I think, that I mentioned in the last video on undereating. So my particular shadow behavior, quick summary, I'm a grown man, I train a lot, I need about 3,000 calories a day, and yet I always undereat. That's my shadow behavior. How would I work on my shadow behavior? Close my eyes, don't need to close my eyes, some people do need to close their eyes, I personally don't need to do it, my imagination will just go off, I'm going to repeat it and kind of share it as we're going through it. I want to meet my shadow behavior, a bit messy, but I'm doing it in real time. I'm literally trying to make it as real and accessible and tangible as possible. It's exactly what I do in my shadow work library course. Might as well promote it on the screen right now. You can see that I've got lots of exercises, lots of videos, and this is what we're doing behind the closed doors. I'm trying to condense as much as I can into this 8-part shadow work series and give you organic moments that feel like a real therapy session rather than some nonsense YouTube entertainment. Back to the video itself. Shadow behavior. My not overeating, undereating. I'm curious why I have this shadow behavior of undereating, so I would say to myself, can I please see the entity who's responsible for my undereating? Instantly, I see my inner child because I've already done years of work with my inner child. I know my inner child pretty well at this point. If this is your first time doing this kind of work, you might see an inner child between the age of 3 and about 16. For me personally, I see myself about age 7, age 8. I'm seeing myself, the whole story's there. I've got the lesson, like that's it. Unfortunately, this isn't a great demonstration because I just saw the image. I'm going to break it down now, but the image appeared in full 360 degree. I saw a variety of different moments. They all coalesced. I saw myself about age 7 and about age 12. 2 different inner children came in about 3 seconds, and here's the full story that I'm going to unpack. I didn't even need to have the dialogue. That's unfortunately not a great video for me to make because I'm trying to encourage an active conversation, but if you are particularly imaginative, you will see the story in visual form, and if you have that element of narrative unpacking capacity, you'll be able to, you'll know from the image. The image that I saw myself, age 7 or age 8, as the inner child responsible for my undereating behavior, being sat down at the family dinner table, I think on a Sunday, that would be the Sunday roast in the UK, and unfortunately, my mother had an anxious energy, my father had an angry energy, and I always felt like I was imprisoned in those situations because fundamentally my childhood pattern was wanting to be alone, wanting to play by myself, and avoid the uncomfortable energies in my family home by isolating into my own creative play and my own video game kind of fantasy worlds, but also Lego and drawing and stories, but fundamentally, I just wanted to be left alone. So when dinner time came around, or when it was a Sunday lunch, I'd be sat down at the table. It was the one meal of the week that we'd eat at the table. The other meals would be eaten in front of the TV. Classic unconscious British style, where you just watch whatever happens to be on television and don't talk to each other. Bit of a rant there. I think it's dreadful. I don't even own a television at this point. I've got my own shadow relationship with TV. I had this moment. Hopefully this is interesting for you. I'm working with it in real time, and we will bring it back around to how to start a dialogue. If you don't get the full story, I will make it. I'm trying to do a lot in one single video. I saw in a little 7, 8-year-old Jordan, he's anxious at the table. I saw me kind of like small at the table. My parents are much bigger. I didn't want to eat because my throat's closed up because there's anxiety. There's an overstimulated response. You don't want to eat when you're stressed. And now I am picking at the sea of brown on my plate because I didn't have very much home cooking, in all honesty, during my childhood. No one's fault, not blaming anyone, just the nature of the culture. I had pretty low quality food, often in the oven or in the microwave, a world of difference from how I eat now, with a primarily organic lifestyle that's focused on health, fitness, longevity, and a balanced nutritional profile. But back then, I didn't have very interesting food, I didn't have very tasty food, and the environment itself wasn't very inviting. That's the first image, the little table image. About half a second later or a second later, I saw myself about age 12, age 11, 12, 13, going downstairs sometime in the middle of the night to go and get some food by myself when everyone's fallen asleep, and then I'd take that snack, I'd make a sandwich, I'd do something to get some kind of food, and either I'd eat it in the kitchen by myself or I'd come upstairs and eat it in my room after everyone else is gone. So there's my initial reconciliation attempt of the wounded inner child that I was, age 7, age 8, who had that particular relationship with food being an uncomfortable experience. Because of the energies that were just too overstimulating or I wanted to disconnect from, I then found a primary form of healing that or fixing that as best as I could, given the circumstances, which is I'm not going to eat when everyone else eats. I will eat later in the day by myself. And that's why, that's the under-eating pattern. If I think about how I eat now, I eat my dinners very, very late at the end of the workday. I work internationally, so my workdays extend until 1, 2, or 3 a.m. sometimes, but I still eat very late in the day. I don't have any particular issues eating in front of people, don't have any issues eating food itself. I just generally don't want to eat food. I tend to put it off not as something that's enjoyable. I'm not someone who's thinking about the next meal. I'm not someone who's interested in, well, I traveled for 2 years around Europe, backpacking full-time while volunteering on farms. I could not give less of a crap about the food that I was eating at any place. I was interested in the environment, I was interested in nature, I was interested in the work itself, and sometimes the people I was meeting, but primarily it was the environment and the task. I wasn't interested in consumption. I wasn't interested in food. I wanted to have enough calories to get me going and keep somewhat of a exercise-focused protein intake so I could do some ring workouts on the rings I traveled with. I just didn't care about food, but the origin, through the active imagination, if I didn't know this, oh, it's my inner child. I undereat because I've got enough experiences deep inside my nervous system of my inner child not feeling comfortable eating, and that's yet to be healed inside of me. And then there's a rudimentary fix of my inner adolescent trying to kind of eat, and then later on I could explore this later out. Let's go with the conversational element. If I were to actually have a conversation with the inner child and do a real-time breakdown of what's happening there, I would go into the scene. I'm sitting down at the table, maybe make my parents disappear, and I say to my inner child, why are you not eating your food? And my inner child would say, it's stressful here. I don't want to eat. I don't feel like eating. Can I eat this later? There's the dialogue. I mean, I've unpacked the entire dialogue. I know this part. I'm not sure if it was the best thing for me to demonstrate on video, and I did this over in the course as well. I did it with the same kind of concept, but with, I think it was my my spiritual self. It was, I was looking at the spiritual self entity, and I was also looking at my relationship with Bedtime Rebellion. I did 2 different versions of this exercise. And both of them, unfortunately, because I've gotten to a certain point in my own active imagination, I get the image instantly, and then I don't need the dialogue. So if you do have the image and you can unpack it, fantastic. I also do that. If you do need the dialogue, you just have a simple conversation. Curious questions, non-judgmental. Don't try and bring your values and incentives and action-oriented outcomes in too quickly. You're talking to your inner child, or a wounded part, or maybe a malicious shadow entity of some form or another. Just have a grounded conversation. You'll notice I'm not going into this conversation with my inner child all terrified and like I don't want to upset my inner child. I'm going to sit down really carefully. I'm going to pull the chair out really slowly and sit down and say, there, what's wrong? I don't think you should talk to children like that. I think you should talk to them like conscious sentient beings. You should calibrate and be sensitive. I'm not going in talking the same way I talk with you. I'm asking, hey, what's wrong? Why are you not eating your food? I'm not changing who I am. I'm just having a normal conversation. The conversation would then continue, and I could say something like, what would you need to want to eat your food? Less shouting. That's the answer. There's me being real. It's not new information. My inner child didn't feel safe, wants less shouting. It's not rocket science. It's not a complex question. What's the actual healed solution? Well, I can then ask my inner child, what would you need to feel safe, eating as much food as you wanted, as often? And then I can't even finish the sentence. The answer that comes into my mind intrusively is sometimes I don't want to eat. Why do I need to have breakfast every day? My inner child doesn't want to have breakfast. And then again, another series of associated memories of being told that I need to have breakfast before school and having to eat these pieces of toast or crappy British cereal before going to school. And I hated it. I've never enjoyed breakfast for whatever reason, or the reasons I've shared with you in this video. I just don't like breakfast. I feel fantastic now being very well hydrated with a good cup of coffee and then being in the energetic flow. I haven't eaten yet today because I've been awake, I think at this point, well, timing-wise, it's about 4 or 5 hours into my day. I haven't eaten yet. And I can film this video for you because I'm clear, I'm focused, and I feel good in my energy. After I finish filming, I will eat something and then I'll go to the gym and whatever. Freedom, creative freedom. We're really going all over the place here. I'm trying to make it as mundane and less enchanted as possible. Intentionally, I hope. Yes, admittedly, there's some messiness in this video, but the fundamental principle of active imagination and giving you a guided walkthrough is that this is what it actually looks like. It's not some mystical, magical journey into the inner realms. It can be that. But if I'm working with you in a private session and we're to do an active imagination exercise, I'm not making it a big deal. I'm not turning off the lights, lighting the candles, getting you to go get your sage or your Palo Santo and making a ritual incantation. Like, you're not doing that. I just ask, which part do you think's responsible? And then usually the client says, 1 sec, I'll just check. It's either it could be my inner, I saw my inner child first, but then it could also be, it's either the queen or the crone feminine archetype. And then we start the conversation. What would you want to say? Where would you want to go? Why are they doing this? Normal human conversational things. That's what actually works. Active imagination shouldn't be something which is only saved for special occasions because it's in daydream territory. You're not waiting until the perfect conditions. You can drop into this on a walk, in the car, just anytime realistically. You may have already flitted into imagination space while listening to me talk and break down my own journey. It's not something which needs to be romanticized, because if you romanticize your imagination, you will then feel like you're losing something, or at very worst, at the worst case scenario, you might feel like you only have beauty and joy and enchantment and good feelings when you're going off into the fantasy world. And unfortunately, for both myself, maybe for you and the majority of people who are still watching a video like this over 20 minutes deep, we struggle with dissociation more than the average person because your desire to go into the interior world and explore the nuances of your psyche isn't a normal thing. Not everyone wants to do this. Most people really couldn't care about going into their inner archetypal landscape and meeting the various sub-personalities of their split-off, repressed, disowned shadow selves. It's not normal. And if it's not normal, meaning that most people don't have that, I'm not saying it's good, I'm not saying it's bad, but it's niche territory. You just need to be aware that when you get fascinated by your archetypal journey, you then might start forming a bit of an ego, a bit of a persona around your own mystical capacity. You might start thinking of yourself as a bit of a shamanistic character, or maybe you've got a certain spiritual gift. And that's going to take you much further away from a grounded, healthy, mature ego in contact with your various shadow entities. Don't go there. Just don't go there. If I could go back in my history to when I first started doing serious active imaginations, which I imagine was about 5 years ago, I wish I had been given this conversation by someone who was older than me, further along the path than me, and had just spent more time doing this work to say, hey Jordan, just calm down. Yeah, I know it's interesting, but you also have 4, 5, 6 dreams per night. Not every single dream is that amazing and that magical. Just because it comes up in a vision doesn't necessarily mean it's true. Check this a few times, be a bit more systematic. Just because you saw your inner child this one time and they said, I want less shouting, doesn't mean that you now move halfway across the world and isolate yourself from all humans because you never want to be in a position where you'd ever be shouted at. Extreme example, but maybe my inner child would say, I just don't want to have breakfast, and I would so rigidly try and honor my inner child needs by never having breakfast. Maybe tomorrow I'll wake up and I'm hungry. I'll eat some breakfast. I'm not so rigid. Generally, though, I don't, and it lines with my inner child needs. I wish I had been given this conversation, and I try and keep this grounded, realistic, mature energy throughout the shadow work library, a structured journey of shadow integration. We spend 2 modules looking at the foundations of projection, repression, various complexes, various psychic fragmentations, and then we move into trauma work in a very, very practical way. And that's ultimately the journey. Just start on a sure footing. If I were to work with a different entity, maybe I would have picked out my shadow spiritual self, or I would have picked out a feminine archetype. All I would have done in my particular active imagination is I go to meet the archetype directly. I know I'm meeting the maiden, I know I'm meeting my spiritual self, and an image will appear based on the day, whereas when I saw the maiden, I saw a girl in a white dress running through a field of yellow and pink flowers. Instantly, as soon as I said my spiritual self, I saw a mountaintop scene with a man in an orange robe, because this week I picked up a copy of some Buddhist text and I was reading that, so that's the imagery that came up to my mind. It doesn't mean that that's my spiritual self, always in orange on the mountain. My maiden archetype is always this little girl. I could think of my maiden, I'd reframe it, for example. I'd say something like, hopefully this isn't too much, I'm just being real with you. If I want to reframe my maiden as something which is more of maiden consciousness rather than maiden literalization, I'd ask for an image of my maiden entity. Well, I'd say, I want to go and meet the maiden in her fullness. And then I just saw an older woman. I saw a woman who's in maybe her 20s or even her 30s, and she has that playful look on her face. I can't see anything else. It was just like a playful look. That's actual maiden consciousness. It's not the literalization of the maiden as a little girl, that, very Jungian classic image. And if I wanted to go into my spiritual self, I said I want to meet my spiritual self as embodied in my day-to-day life. I just saw an image of me sat down at the desk rereading that book yet again another time, because my spiritual practice primarily is creating and sharing and trying to offer as much support as I can through my business, through my career, and that's my actual karmic path. The images shift, so don't get fixated on one particular image, don't overvalue one particular shadow part, and just because a shadow part said, I would like this, remember that humans in real life also say a lot of things, and not everything is said with equal power. It's still you. I haven't got time to go into the exact dynamics of subpersonalities and various ego structures. Just don't get enchanted. Go and check back in on multiple occasions. You can read a book like Inner Work by Robert Johnson, which breaks it down step by step. For this video, just take it slow. If you want to continue the journey with me, you can watch the Shadow Work playlist down in the description. I've actually shared 3 hours of material from my course where we're doing practical journaling exercises and really going into territory. Or you can join me immediately on this Shadow Work series for episode 3, where we're going directly into the trauma work and using shadow work as a way of doing that trauma work. It's all language games at this point. Let's just go and heal ourselves. Over here.